Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Terry Gerton, President of the National Academy of Public Administration. On behalf of the entire Academy, I want to say how pleased we are to be the home of the Elliot Richardson Prize Award. Elliot Richardson personified public service. He served in 4 cabinet-level positions in the United States government as the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, and Secretary of Commerce. Mr. Richardson was also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and we wholeheartedly embrace the values of integrity and public service that his life and this award represent. Tonight, we are here to recognize 2 remarkable individuals, Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Anthony Fauci, for their extraordinary accomplishments that continue the standard that Elliot Richardson set through his excellence, integrity, and dedication to our government and the people of this nation. Tonight's event is the result of many months of work and planning, and I want to acknowledge the hard work of the Elliot Richardson Fund Committee, the Prize Nominating Committee, and the Board of the National Academy of Public Administration, all of whom play an important role in preserving this legacy. And I especially want to thank Caitlin Bloom, the Academy's Director of Fellow Engagement, and Betsy Holohan for all of their detailed planning. Let me give a short overview of tonight's program. We'll begin this evening with Mr. J.T. Smith, the co-chair of the Richardson Nominating Committee and an honorary Academy Fellow, who will give remarks and a tribute to Mr. Richardson. Mr. Smith will be followed by Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, an Academy Fellow, and the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, who will introduce our prize winners. Following these tributes, Mr. Michael Rogers, Chairman of the Richardson Prize Committee, will award the Richardson Prize to our honorees. And we will also induct Drs. Collins and Fauci as honorary fellows of the Academy. Our program will then follow, and we are pleased to have tonight's conversation led by Mr. Chuck Todd, moderator of NBC's Meet the Press. Following the discussion, there will be a question and answer session, and we encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A function of the webinar as the program goes along. So again, thank you for joining our program this evening. I'll now turn it over to Mr. J.T. Smith.
Thank you, Terry. It is my real privilege tonight to say a few words about Elliot Richardson, whose example we are honoring this evening. I worked with Elliot in 5 of his last 6 public engagements. He was my mentor and my friend. In prior Richardson Prize ceremonies, I have had occasion to highlight the ways in which he exemplified the attributes celebrated by the Richardson Prize, including generosity of spirit, as well as courage, integrity, and thoughtfulness in pursuit of government excellence. This evening, more than 2 decades after his death, it is appropriate simply to remind ourselves of the sheer scope and diversity of his public service. His 15 full-time public service posts included military service, roles in all 3 branches of government at the federal level, and senior elected office in the state of Massachusetts. His first commissioned service was actually in a medical role. He was a medical officer who went ashore on D-Day in Normandy. After law school, he clerked in the judicial branch for 2 of the premier jurists of the 20th century, Learned Hand and Felix Frankfurter. In his early 30s, he worked in the legislative branch as a staff assistant to Senator Leverett Saltonstall, and subsequently he served as a young assistant secretary of HEW for legislative affairs in the Eisenhower administration. His first stint in the Department of Justice was as United States Attorney for Massachusetts. After that, he was the elected Lieutenant Governor and Attorney General of Massachusetts. Richardson then filled an extraordinary series of posts in the federal government mentioned by Terry, starting as Undersecretary of State, which was then the number 2 position in the State Department, then Secretary of HEW, which was a period of some length for Richardson, who tended to move from cabinet department to cabinet department very quickly. But he was Secretary of HEW from June of 1970 till January of 1973. Following that, he was briefly Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and then Secretary of Commerce. In the course of these posts, he would run into the role of taking somewhat differing positions on particular issues, and he often invoked a law first enunciated by a famous public administrator named Rufus Miles. And Miles' law says, where I stand depends upon where I sit. But he did that without ever sacrificing his integrity. Subsequently, Richardson served in the Carter administration for 3 years as ambassador to the UN Law of the Sea Conference. As part of the endangered species of moderate Republicans, Richardson had no opportunity for full-time public service for the last 2 decades of his life. He did run in 1984 in the Republican primary for Senate in Massachusetts, where he lost to a conservative Republican businessman, Ray Shamey, who then went on to be roundly defeated by a young up-and-comer named John Kerry. It is especially fitting that we are awarding the Richardson Prize this evening to 2 exceptional public servants and doctors. Richardson was, in his family, an apostate. Everybody for generations on both his father and his mother's side of the family had been doctors. Both of Elliot Richardson's brothers became doctors, one a neurologist and the other a surgeon. Richardson's first commission, as I've already said, was in a medical role. And when he was a medical officer, he was following in the footsteps of his father, who'd been a medic in the First World War. I can attest that while Richardson was Secretary of HEW, he took a lively interest in and held deep respect for the work of the NIH. Although to the best of my knowledge, he did not have the opportunity to know a promising young doctor working there then named Anthony Fauci. Undoubtedly, Richardson would warmly applaud tonight's honorees. I now turn the proceedings over to another exceptional doctor and public servant, Joshua Sharfstein. He is a professor of the practice of health policy and management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he also serves as Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and as Director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative. He is a pediatrician by training. He is the former Health Commissioner of Baltimore, Principal Deputy Commissioner of FDA, and Health Secretary of Maryland. He's the author, presciently, of a book entitled Public Health Crisis Survival Guide, Leadership and Management in Trying Times, 2018. And I turn the proceedings over to Dr. Sharfstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith, Terry. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to start this introduction by saying something obvious. Prizes are intended to honor the people who receive them. That's pretty much the point of prizes. The Elliot Richardson Prize is for individuals who exemplify, quote, excellence and integrity in government service, reflecting the extraordinary career of Elliot Richardson himself, which we just heard about, he famously resigned as Attorney General rather than fire the Watergate special prosecutor. Among the past winners of the prize are Sandra Day O'Connor and Colin Powell. So it is indeed quite an honor to receive the Elliot Richardson Prize. But there are moments like today when a prize is not just a prize, and when an honor is not just an honor to those who receive it. At these special moments, the prize sends a message to the larger society, and the honor extends to those of us so fortunate to be here in the presence of the winners. Dr. Francis Sellers Collins and Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci are physicians and scientists who have devoted their careers to understanding and defeating threats to human health. Raised on a small farm in Virginia and homeschooled through the 6th grade, Dr. Collins studied at the University of Virginia, Yale, and the University of North Carolina. Early in his career, he made seminal contributions to genetics, including the identification of the genes responsible for cystic fibrosis and many other conditions. He then went on to direct the Human Genome Project before taking the helm of the National Institutes of Health 12 years ago. Among his many awards, Dr. Collins has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Templeton Prize, which recognizes his work exploring the intersection of religion, faith, and science. When Dr. Collins stepped down from the NIH in December, video tributes poured in from around the world, including from Lionel Richie, Yo-Yo Ma, Diane Rehm, the Dalai Lama, 4 US presidents, and Barbara Streisand. Now you can stay up late at night watching these videos. Believe me, I know. Now to Dr. Fauci, Brooklyn-born, who spent his early years delivering prescriptions for his father's pharmacy before studying at the College of the Holy Cross and Cornell University. Since 1984, Dr. Fauci has led the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH, where he has made critical contributions to the understanding of infectious disease and immunology. Dr. Fauci, or Tony as he is now known around the world, was a public health legend well before the SARS-CoV-2 virus entered our world, as a result of his efforts to fight the HIV epidemic. He began by caring for AIDS patients in clinic and on the hospital wards, a phenomenal clinician according to people who work with him. He rewrote the rules for clinical trials with HIV advocates at his side. He helped design and fund the studies that demonstrated the value of highly effective HIV treatments, and then he made these treatments available to the world through the PEPFAR initiative. It is no understatement to say his efforts saved millions of lives. Among his many awards, I should say it is no overstatement to say that his efforts saved millions of lives. Among his many awards, Dr. Fauci also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is a Guardian of the Year from Time Magazine, a Science Defender of the Year from Nature Magazine, and a Person of the Year from People Magazine. Let's be honest. Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci could have received the Elliot Richardson Prize for their incredible careers at any point in at least the last 2 decades. But they are receiving it this year. That's when NAPA is giving it to them. They're receiving it in 2022. They're receiving the Elliot Richardson Prize in a year in which, quote, excellence and integrity in government service have somehow become fighting words. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen politics hit science in the mouth and public service. We have watched as thousands of public servants have been harassed, threatened, and attacked. We have heard such conspiracies and nonsense that it is natural to wonder whether there is any room left for the common good. On one hand, the pandemic has been an extraordinary time for science. The scientific achievements of Dr. Collins in genetics and Dr. Fauci in immunology and infectious disease have made possible what previously could barely have been imagined: the rapid development of incredibly safe and effective COVID vaccines, which have saved so many lives in the United States and around the world. On the other hand, this extraordinary time for science has come with a terrible price for public health leaders. In the center of the storm, both Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci have stood up at every turn for the common good, speaking the truth to 2 presidents, Congress and the public, and confronting misinformation and disinformation wherever they see it. They have given truth to an observation of Miguel de Cervantes, which translates as, quote, "The truth may be stretched thin, but it never breaks. It always surfaces above lies, as oil floats on water." So I come back to this. There are moments when prizes do more than honor those who receive them. In giving this prize to Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci today, the National Academy of Public Administration is making a statement that excellence and integrity in government service matters, even now, especially now. And in accepting the Elliot Richardson Prize, Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci are doing more than just nudging over their presidential medals of freedom with a new piece of hardware. They're inspiring a generation of public servants to stand true to their values at this unprecedented time for our democracy and for the health of our nation and the world. Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, I'm sure that I'm speaking for my colleagues in the National Academy of Public Administration to say, while the prize may be yours, the honor is ours. Now, to read the citation, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael C. Rogers, a city leader who now works in Charlottesville, Virginia, and previously served Petersburg, Virginia, New York City, and the District of Columbia. He received a JD from Georgetown University National Law Center and a master's in public policy from the Ford School for Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Clark College and is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. He is a fellow of the National Academy for Public Administration, has served on the board and as vice chair. He is currently a member of the Board Governance Committee and, most importantly for this, chair of the Elliot Richardson Prize Fund Committee. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chapperstein. Good evening, Napa fellows and friends. I am very pleased to be with you this evening for another presentation of the Elliot Richardson Award. The bylaws of the Elliot Richardson Award state that the prize is to be awarded to individuals possessing the public service virtues exemplified by Elliot Richardson. Those individuals to be selected to receive the Elliot Richardson Prize shall have demonstrated achievement by significantly advancing the public good, a long-term dedication to public service by serving the public interest in a public service capacity, generosity, the generosity of spirit, thoughtfulness, and in the pursuit of excellence in government, courage, and integrity. Tonight, we are presenting this award for the 7th time since NAPA has become a sponsor in 2010. Since its first award by the Council of Excellence in Government in 2002, 17 outstanding public administrators have been awarded the Richardson Prize. We are particularly happy tonight to present this award to 2 outstanding public leaders, as you have heard. On behalf of the NAPA Board and the Elliot Richardson Prize Fund Committee, I am very pleased to present first the 2022 Elliot Richardson Prize to Dr. Francis Collins. The citation reads, awarded to Dr. Francis S. Collins, physician, scientist, author, public servant, amateur musician, administrator of the National Institutes of Health under 3 presidents, and consistently calm and thoughtful voice in the heat of a pandemic. Dr. Collins' leadership in mapping the genome helped pave the way for today's vaccines to combat coronaviruses. His long tenured leadership of NIH, characterized by integrity and humility, has compelled bipartisan admiration in a fractious age. And by adherence to his faith, Dr. Collins has reminded all of us of the openness to mysteries can advance rather than impede scientific endeavor and the public interest. We're very pleased to present this to Dr. Francis Collins. Now, on behalf of the NAPA Board and the Elliot Richardson Prize Fund Committee, I am pleased to present the Elliot Richardson Prize for 2022 to Dr. Anthony S. Fauci. The citation reads, awarded to Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, physician, scientist, public health administrator, and leader. Dr. Fauci has served 7 presidents over 50 years, advising on the most challenging public health crises of our time. He has been at the forefront of the U.S. efforts to contend with viral diseases like HIV, SARS, the 2009 swine flu pandemic, MERS, Ebola, and now the COVID-19. Dr. Fauci was one of the leading members of the President's Coronavirus Task Force addressing the 2019 to current coronavirus pandemic in the United States, providing a clear, consistent, trusted voice in public health. In the face of many competing voices, Dr. Fauci remained committed to the science and demonstrated courage as an unwavering, trusted voice to the nation and world on behalf of science-based policy and public health. As a public servant, Dr. Fauci is an exemplar of the requisite personal character and public service recognized by the Elliot Richardson Prize. I congratulate you, both of you, on your outstanding public service. We're very pleased to have you tonight. And this prize fund always has a special feature to it. At the end, we have a conversation with the honorees. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Chuck Todd. Chuck Todd, NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, spearheads the network's premier political coverage, offering insider analysis and translation of Beltway politics across all platforms, zeroing in on what really matters in Washington and why. Todd is a primary anchor of the network's primetime election coverage and is known for holding politicians and newsmakers accountable, as well as conducting in-depth news-making interviews with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Todd has earned the reputation as one of Washington's most respected political journalists, paving the way for Meet the Press to become the #1 Sunday public affairs program, winning across the board for the 2018-19 broadcast season. We're very pleased to have and honored to have Chuck Todd to lead the conversation tonight. Chuck, it's in your hands.
Well, thank you. I will tell you, this was one of the easier invites to say yes to, because I'm a pretty cynical guy. I've met a lot of politicians and I've met a lot of government and public servants. And let's just say I've admired Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci from afar. And the more I've spent time with them, I still admire them. I can't say that for most guests on Meet the Press sometimes. So, but before I begin, guys, I think incredible things have been said about both of you, these citations. And so just take a minute, because I got breaking news. There's two interesting pieces of breaking news that I want to ask you both about, but I just want to give you both a minute. Dr. Collins, what does this mean? Getting something like this about public service.
This is a phenomenal evening and incredible reflection on Elliot Richardson's service. And to imagine that that's something that would apply to me is pretty breathtaking when you consider, as we've heard from Mr. Smith, all the many ways in which Elliot Richardson contributed to our government over so many years. I thought I was a long timer, but I'm not even close to the way in which he contributed himself to so many aspects of leadership. So it means a lot to be in this role. And again, I really appreciated what Josh Sharfstein said, that the recognition here is not just about Tony and me, it's also about the importance of public health and the importance of truth in conveying public health messages, which is something I'm deeply concerned about, and perhaps we'll talk about this evening. That's something I didn't anticipate would be so prominent in the face of this pandemic, and has cost many lives. And that is certainly something that the National Academy of Public Administration cares deeply about, as do all of us who care about the future of our world. So I'm truly grateful. I want to say that everything that I've accomplished over these years as a public servant has mostly happened because I surrounded myself by amazing people, and we worked in teams that could do things that no single individual could dream of. So I'm accepting this on behalf of all those folks who worked with me on the Genome Project, on various medical genetics projects, and over those 12 years as NIH director.
And Dr. Fauci, when I hear the name Elliot Richardson, I think of somebody country first, right? Country before party, before politics. And to me, there's no higher honor in public service than being thought of as somebody who wasn't political or isn't political. So just your feelings on this, Dr. Fauci.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. I must say, I echo many of the sentiments of my colleague and friend, Francis College. I am rather humbled by this honor. I've had privilege historically, as was mentioned in the introduction, that I was a young physician scientist in my very early years at the NIH when Elliot Richardson was the secretary of then the Department of Education, Health Education, and Welfare. And I have been marveling from a distance about how someone who has such extraordinary capabilities was excellent at such a wide diversity of responsibility. If you look at the cabinet posts that he held, all of which were done with such a profound degree of integrity, culminated by the historic event when he resigned by not giving in to the wishes and demands of a president who was clearly doing something that was illegal. I mean, that is something that stands out as the epitome of honor, integrity, and courage. So I really feel extraordinarily fortunate, pleased, particularly pleased to be sharing this with my dear friend and colleague of so many years, Francis Collins. And Francis said it very well. There are so many people that we've been involved with over the years who never get on television and to get the privilege of being interviewed by you, Chuck, on Meet the Press or in any of the other media outlets. But those are the ones that make these things happen, particularly the extraordinary accomplishment of the scientific community in getting vaccines that were made available literally 11 months from the time the virus was identified, a completely and totally unprecedented feat in science. And that really is to the credit of so many scientists. Also, just want to say one word about what Josh mentioned. It's a particularly difficult time for those of us in public service now, because for reasons that are just so painful and astounding, we've become the targets of things like conspiracy theories and ad hominems. That just is something that is very, very discouraging to the young scientists and people who want to go into public service. And I could tell those who might be listening that despite all of that, the feeling that you get of accomplishment of serving the people of the United States and the world is worth all of the difficulties that we're going through, because they will pass and integrity will prevail. Thank you.
Well, look, I said there were two pieces of interesting news just in the headlines today that I want to talk to you about. One is the never-ending set of jobs that Dr. Collins is now acquiring. We'll get to that in a second. But I want to get to before the pandemic, if Dr. Fauci, the first thing anybody would be running to you about, asking is like, hey, we got some news about HIV today. Well, we got some news about HIV. The third potential person cured. First time it's a woman cured. I'm just curious. And I know I know you follow it closely, but you probably haven't been able to dive too deeply. But what does this moment mean? How soon, how far away are we from the full-fledged cure for HIV?
Well, Chuck, this is a proof of concept. The mechanisms whereby this person was put into, quote, a cure, which means for an extended period of time, nowhere could you isolate the virus from that individual. And right now it's been close to 2 years, about 14 or 15 months that the person has been free. This is not something that is practically applicable to the 36 million people living with HIV. But what it does yet again, since it's the third example, the first one being the famous girl inpatient who had a stem cell transplant associated with an underlying disease. So although it's not broadly applicable, it just continues to confirm and underscore the hope that there will be mechanisms in the future. And we are working on that at the NIH. Francis and I, together with people at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others, have been working on that now for some time. So we have a considerable degree of optimism that this is something that, although aspirational, I believe will be achievable.
It certainly feels that way. And Dr. Collins, the news is about you today, as far as what I had for you. What about this retiring thing that happened in December? I guess that we put that on the shelf. You're going to be the acting science advisor. He's splitting up the shop in two. What does that mean? And how much of your job is pandemic and how much of it is giving the president some advice on NASA, for instance?
So yeah, this is news that's about an hour and a half old, but I guess it's a good time for us to talk about it. Yeah, my wife sent a note to some of our friends a little bit ago saying, Houston, we have a problem. The rocket has failed to reach escape velocity. So what was supposed to be a very quiet 2022 with opportunities for me to be back in my lab, which I love, maybe write a book about something that I'd care about and think about what the next chapter might be. Well, that lasted less than 2 months. Basically, I have been asked by the president to serve as the acting science advisor to the president. And along with me in a wonderful way as a partner, Dr. Alondra Nelson will serve as the acting director of OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Those are two separate jobs. They've sometimes been held by the same person. Eric Lander held both of those jobs until his recent surprise resignation. And basically the terminology the president used is, I want to double down on this scientific challenge. So I guess I'm part of the doubling down. I'm honored to be asked to do this. It wasn't part of my life plan, but I do think public service is a privilege and it gives your life the kind of meaning that almost nothing else can. And we're all kind of looking for that, aren't we? My challenge is to oversee 4 different things. One is to find the next NIH director, because we need to find that perfect person. Another is to help shepherd this new component of the biomedical research enterprise called ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health, which is modeled after DARPA in the Department of Defense, to be very bold, very risk-taking, very fast-moving, very much willing to do partnerships with whoever has the skills and talents that are needed, but apply it to health, which we very much think would belong as a new division at NIH. And it's got a lot of momentum, but it's not over the finish line. So, and it's a big priority for the president. Another is the Cancer Moonshot 2.0 that the president is very fired up about. I will do everything I can to help that go forward. And then there is this business of the PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. On Monday, I will become the co-chair of that, along with Nobel Prize winner Francis Arnold and Maria Zuber from MIT, and they have a lot of really exciting things to work on. On top of that, I'm sort of told, if this is your role, you got to be the one that sort of pops in when the president has a science idea and wants to bounce it off of somebody, and that could be a lot of fun. So that's what I'll be doing for the next bit. Again, this is not something that I signed up on for a very long time. The White House now needs to identify a person to nominate and hopefully get confirmed to step in to take both of these roles, director of OSTP and science advisor. And when that person gets confirmed, I will wish them well and go running back to my lab.
Yeah, sure you will. And in fact, let me start there. I want to start broad, and then I want to get into this, and it's an idea you had, Dr. Collins, about maybe one area we need to study is this behavioral science aspect. But I want to start big picture. And Dr. Fauci, you take this question, which is, I think I know the answer to this, but what is the pull of the government lab, if you will, versus the university lab, right? You guys are researchers at heart. You want to find these answers. And when I talk to scientists, there's nothing like the federal government. Explain whether it's DARPA, BARDA. You talked about Army. You know, I had a European ambassador say to me, I said, why did the EU look like it wasn't ready for this? And they're like, one word, we don't have BARDA. We need to create our own BARDA. So what is the draw of the government lab, Dr. Fauci?
Well, by the government lab, Chuck, I believe you're referring to the intramural program. For example, the intramural research program. A typical example of that is a component of my own institute, which I established about 21 years ago, is called the Vaccine Research Center of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. It is very representative of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of investigators who are full-time government employees who do the kind of groundbreaking research where they concentrate only on the research. They have very little responsibilities at a university level, for example, to teach, to give lectures, they just do their research. And they have the opportunity to do high risk, high reward research. So instead of putting a grant in and have to make a proposal, they get judged on their performance. And it gives you the opportunity to do very, very bold things. I had the pleasure and the privilege of doing that very early in my career with inflammatory diseases that I brought patients in that you could never do in a hospital setting on the outside because you could keep a patient in indefinitely to study them, whereas it wasn't the kind of commercial issue where you've got to get somebody out of the hospital.
Right.
The similarity, Chuck, that is a good similarity, is that about 11% or so of the NIH's budget is the intramural research program. Subtract a bit for the administration, and the rest of that, 70+%, is grants and contracts to extramural scientists who may do the same type of research that we do. The only difference is that you mentioned the word BARDA. For example, we could do things now in the government where you get a research concept, you get it quickly. We established a clinical trial network that I had the opportunity to be involved with from my institute about 40 years ago to establish the largest clinical trial network ever established throughout the world. What did that do? It could not have been done without the federal government, without the government aspect of it, is that we did all of the clinical trials that established HIV drugs to essentially provide the transformative, life-saving remissions in people with HIV. That was the network that we established. We converted that network to develop and to test all of the vaccines that were involved with COVID-19. So those things would not have happened if we didn't have the firm commitment of resources year after year for the combination of the government scientists, the grantees, as well as industry. And that's a beautiful union, Chuck. It's the kind of thing that makes the spectacular, breathtaking results that we've seen with COVID-19.
Yeah, Dr. Collins, the public-private partnership, I feel like if we take the politics out of the last year in our heads, this is the where the public and the private sector meet at NIH seems to be the most effective public-private partnership we have.
I think it is. It doesn't happen just automatically, but there's so many reasons to help catalyze it in terms of making rapid progress. You need to be thoughtful about how you do this so that you are working in an area that doesn't run the academic contributors or the government contributors into a conflict of interest. And that generally means you're working in a pre-competitive space. But when you do it in a fashion where you bring around the same table the best and brightest scientists from the public and the private sector, and oftentimes the regulators need to be there too, because that can really help you design the research so that it gets to a patient as rapidly as possible, then amazing things can happen. One of the things that I had a lot of positive experiences with as NIH director was something called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, where we basically tried to find out amongst academics and industry, where are the barriers to making progress, particularly to finding the next generation of therapeutics for diseases like Alzheimer's and diabetes. We got everybody together and we thought about it long and hard and took a chance that if we worked on this together in a very intense way, we could move the ball forward. And industry, I was sufficiently excited about that they agreed to cover part of the cost, about half the cost. So they had skin in the game. So did the government. For diabetes, for Alzheimer's, for rheumatoid arthritis, for Parkinson's, and more recently for schizophrenia, and a new program on gene therapy for ultra-rare diseases. All of those are now partnerships with scientists from both sectors working arm in arm in a very pre-competitive way and making progress I didn't think would have been possible. So I'm a big fan of this. And I think everybody who gets involved in those wants to do more of it. Maybe coming out of the Genome Project gave me a sense of just how important it can be to work together, because that was 2,400 scientists in 6 countries working 24/7 and not worrying who got the credit. That's the way you get stuff done.
So I want to shift to the pandemic a little bit. And I want to start with something you said earlier, Dr. Collins, and you've said it in a previous interview, that you actually think there needs to be a scientific study on behavioral science, if you will, when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, when it comes to perhaps virus skepticism. What would a research project look like? That and is this something that NIH should be in, and what would you like to see?
I never dreamed, as we were struggling night and day during 2020 to develop those vaccines that Tony talked about, and his amazing leadership making it possible in just 11 months to have vaccines shown to be safe and effective, actually much better in terms of their efficacy than we had almost dared to hope. I never dreamed that our problem would be not just making the vaccine, but convincing people to use it. I guess I was a little bit too much in a Descartesian kind of mode of thinking that people make decisions based on evidence, and that's all you need is provide the evidence and everything will be fine.
I'm thinking like a scientist.
And yes, in the Super Bowl of mental decision-making, I think Hume beat out Descartes by saying that passions actually run the show and rationality sort of gets in line depending on what your passions want it to do. I don't like to think that that's the way things go, but it sure has turned out to be the case in this instance. So we did not, I think, any of us anticipate that resistance to vaccines, which we knew would be present in some folks because there had already been resistance to other vaccines before COVID came along. But none of us imagined, or at least I don't think very many people did, that this would extend to the point where even today, 50 million Americans, faced with all this evidence of the fact that the vast majority of people who have died since the vaccines became available are all unvaccinated. You'd think that would be enough. And yet tens of millions of people are still very much in a space of having been misled by misinformation and frankly, disinformation that's being spread by people who probably know it's not true for political or other reasons. I didn't know it could be this bad. And I didn't know that it would be that readily possible for good, honorable people to get information like this that was demonstrably false, but actually incorporate it into their own thinking because of the bubble they lived in, because of the way everything has been polarized and weaponized, and that would become a very difficult challenge to overcome. So yeah, I don't know that there had been much in the way of deep research to anticipate this or how best to turn it around. And yeah, I wish we had done more then, and we certainly need to think about it now. How do we do better communication to actually reach through to people who've turned us off? Because it's pretty hard right now to see how to get through. It's clearly not going to be solved without empowering lots of other trusted voices, since at the moment, the government trust doesn't seem to be in a very strong place for a lot of those who are resistant. We have to somehow empower other voices like the pastor in the church, like the physicians who are trying but maybe haven't quite gotten through, like community leaders, just like family members to be ambassadors to their other family members. And maybe we need to do more telling of stories and less of quoting of statistics, because I think people are oftentimes more moved by stories. If you saw the post this morning, long story about the young man whose pregnant wife almost died of COVID and who will probably never be quite normal again. That's pretty heartbreaking. And both of them now seeing this as an avoidable outcome. Those stories really pull at your heartstrings, we should probably be telling them a lot.
It's an interesting thought that more narrative, less data. Even as we're in the media believing that data in this day and age of so much subjectivity, we've leaned more into data and sometimes, but that's an interesting pushback. So Dr. Fauci, you in many ways anticipated this pandemic. You've been quoted multiple times over a decade ago that a coronavirus, was going to probably be the cause of a pandemic. Is this something we're going to get more of? I mean, is this something? And we got to do this after action report because this is going to be every decade we have the threat of one. Is this the world we're living in?
Well, no doubt that if you look at what the underlying conditions are that lead to outbreaks like this, when you look at new viruses, Chuck, that emerge, mostly viruses, but sometimes other types of microbes, about 75% of all the new outbreaks occur from an animal to a human. They're called zoonotic. They essentially are in an animal and they ultimately adapt themselves to humans. The more you encroach upon the animal-human interface, such as the typical wet market situation that we know happened in the first SARS-CoV-1, no doubt how that evolved, as well as very likely, which is the situation currently. We know that from Ebola, when people go into the forest, could get exposed to bats. We know that with influenza, with chickens, pigs, and animal interface that lead to it. If you combine that with the ease of travel, where you can be on another part of the world in a plane trip of 18 hours, essentially around the world, the answer is the more we avoid and neglect the human-animal interface, the more we're going to see the emergence of infections. That's the first thing. Then you have to establish the difference between an emergence and an outbreak and a pandemic, because there's no doubt, Chuck, that given the way microbes interact in our environment, the ecosystem of the human-animal interface, that you're going to have the emergence of new microbes. Whether they turn out to be an outbreak that turns into an uncontrollable pandemic gets to what we've been discussing, that Francis and I have been discussing for the past 2 years, is the global pandemic preparedness. There's no doubt, Chuck, that we will have another pandemic. You know, I said that 20, 30 years ago, and it's happened. Sometimes the outbreaks are trivial curiosities. You have an outbreak of a chicken virus that hits 20, 30, 40 people, has a high degree of mortality, kills 30, 40, 50% of them, but it doesn't adapt itself to the capability of easily transmitting. And then every once in a while, you get a double whammy. And the double whammy is a new virus that not only transmits very, very well, but has a high degree of lethality. It happened in 1918. It happened to a lesser extent in 1957 and 1968, to a much lesser extent. I think a good example was the 2009 swine flu H1N1, a brand new virus emerged from a pig, no doubt, that had the animal-human interface that I mentioned. It had spectacular degree of transmissibility, but is what we call colloquially in the field a wimpy virus, because it didn't make people very sick.
So we got lucky? Was that luck?
We got totally lucky on that one, Chuck. Totally lucky, because we didn't have the capability back then of producing vaccines the way we rapidly did it now with Operation Warp Speed. Yeah. And if you remember the history, it peaked before the vaccines were available to distribute.
Right.
And it was, if you look at that, I have a slide that shows that. It's really quite a lesson on that slide. Then you have something that has a high degree of mortality, but doesn't transmit very well. like the H7N9 viruses in chickens. But every once in a while, the two things come together. And when they do, that's when you have a problem. So the answer to your question, Chuck, it's going to happen again and again, and we've got to be prepared for it.
Well, speaking of again and again, Dr. Collins, variants with COVID. Should we be expecting seasonal variants, essentially, a winter and a summer, kind of like the flu?
Well, SARS-CoV-2 has been a wonderful lesson in viral evolution, if anybody wanted to learn about it. The reason we've had so many variants already is in large part because this virus has been so successful in infecting so many people. Keep in mind, this coronavirus is not particularly high in its mutation rate. It's kind of typical in that way for other coronaviruses. But when you consider how many chances the US population, the world's population, has given this virus to replicate itself, every time it copies, there's that small chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we want to see the likelihood of new variants going down, we also need to drive the viral population down, which is another reason why vaccination has been great to make available in the developed world, but it needs to be also available in the rest of the world. And Tony and I think, are strong proponents of that. And I think the US government has actually done more about that than any other country in the world, but we still have a ways to go. So your question about whether we'll continue to see these, a lot of it is going to depend on whether we are successful in driving the viral population down to a much lower level, because that will predict a lower likelihood of new variants. It won't wipe it out. There is this issue about whether new variants that are really dramatically different, like Omicron, may perhaps arise specifically in individuals who are immunosuppressed, where the virus remains in their system for many months because they can't quite shake it off, and it gradually acquires more and more mutations. And then we're kind of dealing almost with a new character, a new virus to which our previous methods are not optimized anymore. And that's something also we have to pay attention to. We certainly don't want to, for instance, in a place where there are a lot of people infected with HIV, have them getting inadequate treatment for their HIV at the same time that COVID is spreading, because that's a setup for this kind of rapid evolution of new mutations. So the things we can do about this, I guess I would like to think that Omicron is kind of the last really bad surge that we're going to see, but I have no particular reason to say that with confidence.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci, there's a widespread assumption, and I just say this, I don't know, just when you're, whether it's just with colleagues or neighbors or whatever, that, this it'll burn itself out. Will it? Should we? I mean, I say this and should we assume that every variant will be like Omicron, slightly weaker?
Yeah. The answer to that is no. That is not a correct assumption, Chuck. Everybody wants to put the outbreak in the rearview mirror and go away. Well, we can declare ourselves done with the virus, but the virus has not yet declared itself done with us. The best way, and this gets back to your question about hesitancy and Francis's comment about how stunning it is to us that we have such a highly effective vaccine and we're not fully utilizing it. As long as there is the circulation of the dynamics of virus in the community, be it in the United States or anywhere in the world, there will be other variants. So we could be lucky, Chuck. What could happen is that Omicron could, if you look at the curve now, it went way up and it's coming sharply down. It's got to continue to come down. We were at close to 1 million infections a day. And then we went down to 800, 700. Yesterday it was 146,000. We still have over 2,000.
It used to be a high number, by the way. I mean, we're so weirdly, I sit here, I look at it like, well, it's just barely below Delta peak. I mean, is that good or bad? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
And we still have over 2,000 deaths. So as much as we'd like to say we're done with it, we're not. And I know we're fighting against almost a burning desire among the country to get this over with. And the only thing we can say is that we don't like restrictions, we don't like mandates, we don't like to tell people they need to be wearing masks. But the time will come, if you get the virus low enough, that we could get to what I think you're alluding to, Chuck. We can get such a low level of infection that it doesn't really impact society. And we've seen that with other infections. I talk about, we're not going to eradicate it. We've only eradicated one infection, smallpox. We're not going to eliminate it. The only one time you eliminate something is when you have a virus that doesn't mutate very much, like measles and polio, and you get a wide acceptance of vaccination. So the best we can hope for is to get it down so low, and then to have enough people vaccinated or infected recover and have a degree of protection, good antivirals, testing, masking. That's when we could say, you know what? We have virus in the community, but it's not disrupting our function. And I believe we can get there.
Dr. Collins, in 10 years, are we going to look back and say, America was in this pandemic longer than it needed to be because it was a house divided against itself?
I don't think we have to wait 10 years to say that, Chuck. I think we can say that right now. It's hard to estimate just how much harm has already occurred because of our divisions. Certainly those who look at those numbers would estimate that more than 100,000 people have died unnecessarily. Those who were in one way or another convinced that vaccinations were not for them.
I don't know if I would say this on air, but what you're saying is our political divide may have killed 100,000 Americans.
It's more than our political divide. It's sort of the culture wars that we're in the middle of. And so, yeah, the culture wars are killing people, and not just a few here and there. It's not just like we're having a disagreement about what people think is important. We are so fragmented about basic facts that people are making decisions influenced by things that they've read in social media or political statements they've heard from somebody they trust that has caused them to make a life-threatening decision. And that's hard to imagine in the most technologically advanced country in the world. So yeah, I think a lot of people will be writing dissertations about how this could have happened in this country. And there are a lot of reasons for it. Again, as I mentioned, I'm becoming more aware of just how important it is what people's basic framework is of belief, because that's how we all filter the information. This cognitive bias, which we knew was strong, is really strong, especially when we have all kind of decided we are in particular tribal groups. And our view of the other groups is not just that they're misguided, but that they're evil. And so when a message comes at you from that other group that may be life-saving, you immediately need to find a way to disagree with it. And that's where we are. And our politics is about as weaponized as one can imagine, certainly in my lifetime. And that's feeding into it. But there are lots of other forces as well. It's a deep concern for our future as a nation. And it's not just about COVID vaccines. It's about climate change and is it real or not? And I'm not an expert on democracies, but it sure seems to be about elections too.
Yeah, no, it's, I look at it this way, and I'll just say this observationally, the Trump era and all of it together, it's all going to be known as this with what social media is, the havoc it's caused and all of this. If you're still in the job that you had before Trump arrived, you're doing something right. And I guess I would say this, Dr. Fauci, how do you compartmentalize? I've been in the barrel, so I know a little bit about it. You've been in the barrel a lot, as I like to put it. Dr. Collins, you've been in the barrel a little bit, but I think we all will agree here. Dr. Fauci, you've been starring in political ads of late. It's just sort of astonishing to me. But you are compartmentalizing. How do you do it?
Well, you have to do it, Chuck, because if you don't do it, you can't do your job.
You make yourself crazy. It's what I tell
them. You have to focus like a laser on what is important, what your job is, what your mission is, and not get shook by things that are so blatantly untrue. I mean, we talk about things that you know, we're going to be doing analysis of this, as Francis says, but the idea that that lying is completely normalized, and it's normalized because the people are lying, but the people who you would expect would push back on the lies are not pushing back.
They're afraid of those people lying.
Yeah, that's the thing that
They fear the liars, I guess.
you know, that is so astounding when you think about the sociology of that, where someone gets up and there's something in front of you that's so obvious. I mean, I don't want to get into any of the politics because that'll just give people more ammunition to throw at me and my family. But how can you look at what happened on January 6th and with a straight face say there was nothing abnormal about that? I mean, to me, that's going to be the epitome example of the complete dissociation of truth in our society. That's very, very scary, because if that happens, Chuck, I mean, I don't like to be the target of political ads and people lying about me and threatening me and my family, but it even goes beyond me. It makes me worry about where our society is going. What about our children and our grandchildren? I mean, are they going to have to live through a dystopian society? Because it certainly looks like that's where we're going.
Well, my fear, and one of the reasons why I'm glad that we're celebrating the public service of both you and Dr. Collins, is simply, I'm worried about the next generation and the next generation not wanting to get into public service, fearing it's a bad thing, and only leaving it to the folks that are trying to hijack it. I'm curious, Dr. Fauci, you were in the barrel during the AIDS crisis and you got attacked and you got death threats. Compare the two moments that you lived through as far as the public attacks, if you will.
They were totally different, Chuck, and I'm glad you asked that question.
Mm-hmm.
When we were dealing with the activists, interestingly, the ones that are on the films,
Act Up, right? Yeah.
Act Up,
Yep.
what Fauci said, those people right now, honestly, are some of my closest personal friends.
I know, I've read these stories. They're amazing.
Yeah. And the reason is that they were iconoclastic, they were theatrical, because they needed people to listen to what they were saying. There was never anything untruthful about what they did. They were pushing back. I can tell you an example of that would answer your question. When back in the 80s, when I was really doing something that I think was one of the most important things that I'm proud of, is to reaching out to the activists and saying, put aside the iconoclastic behavior, put aside the theatrics, and listen to what they're saying. They were making absolutely perfect sense that the rigidity of the scientific community, the rigidity of the regulatory community was out of step with the reality of what they were going through. So the very fact that I was able alone to go down to the Gay and Lesbian Community Center in Greenwich Village, surrounded by 100 gay activists who were there saying, you know, Fauci, you're killing us, and feeling, Chuck, perfectly safe. There was no one there that was wishing me harm. They just wanted me to listen to them. That is completely different from people who do complete ad hominem attacks to discredit you, and quite frankly, by doing that, to discredit science. Those young gay men were not trying to discredit science. They wanted science to work for them. It is completely different, those two things.
Dr. Collins, the other concern I'm guessing you have is, look, you've been around this town a while. You've been right. You know how to compartmentalize. I think about, though, the Amy Actons of the world. Amy Acton was the public health director in the state of Ohio at the start of the pandemic. I think she experienced both the highs and the lows of becoming an instant face, if you will, of this. But a lot of these people want to leave those public health jobs on the state and local level because they've been getting harassed in ways that, in some ways, we can be protected here on the federal level. What do we do about this on the state and local? And how bad, there are some states, including my home state of Florida, who has chief science or medical advisors that would not necessarily qualify as that in alternative universes.
That's a really troubling situation, to be sure. And to see the way in which many of these state-based or local-based health officers trying to do their job have been demonized and basically driven into something else really is troubling about the future. I mean, how are we going to fix this? We have somehow got to address the broader societal problem that we've lost our anchor to truth, that just doesn't seem to be winning the argument the way that the latest loud declaration of some misinformation is carrying the day. And ultimately, if our democracy is going to survive, it's also going to be the solution, that we will recognize that this is not a pathway that has a future for our country. And we can't keep electing people who support that kind of misinformation being spread and allow their public health officials to be treated in this way, or even sometimes encourage it. We have a sickness in our land. Without treating that sickness, I don't know how we're going to fix individual circumstances of public health experts who are trying to do their best.
No, and you brought up climate change. I mean, when we start pitting communities against each other, which community is, in a flood zone, which isn't, why am I moving my house? Just wait. You're absolutely right. It's something I fear as we move to the next crisis where the experts are going to say something and we're not going to want to, quote, believe the experts. So Dr. Fauci, let's set aside the public divide here. In the scientific community and what are some of the things you wish we did differently in this pandemic, knowing what we know now?
Well, Chuck, that's an interesting question, because if we knew then what we know now about the dynamics of this outbreak, we would have done a lot of things differently. Mm-hmm. So technically, you would say we did something that wasn't right. We made a mistake. But at the time, it may not have been. And let me give you the evolution of it. And I know you know the history, but very briefly, the first appearance of the virus was that it was jumping from an animal to human and didn't efficiently transmit to humans. Then it became clear the Chinese were not particularly forthcoming about that. Then it became clear that it transmits pretty well from human to human. And then it became clear that it transmits very well from human to human. And then it became clear months later that over half of the infections are transmitted by people who have no symptoms at all. So if we knew that from day one, we would have done things very differently. We would have been having masks on everybody. We would have realized that it was a silent virus among us. We would have probably been very careful about personal interaction. We would have done things a lot bit differently, but we didn't know it. And the ironic thing about it is, Chuck, if back then, because I remember I got asked a question that people keep distorting the answer. They show a clip of me in January or February and say, this was like there were 2 infections in the United States, or 1 infection.
Right.
You think we should be doing anything different? Should the American public be doing anything different? And I said, I don't think we should be doing anything different right now, but that could change. No one ever talks about, but that could change. They just say you wouldn't do anything different.
Nuance, I know, context, nuance. I know those are crazy ideas.
But the fact is that even if we said, folks, guess what? We're dealing with a silent threat. We need to shut down things. The American people would have never, ever accepted that. They just would not have. What do you mean? You have 5 infections in the country and you want to shut down the country? Are you crazy? They would throw you out. But the fact is, while we were not realizing that, the virus was silently spreading throughout the country. So if we had known that, we certainly would have done things differently. But I'm not sure the country would have accepted our doing things differently.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
we
go
didn't
ahead.
do it.
Yeah.
We didn't do a great job, I think, of explaining that recommendations were likely to need to change as more scientific information came across. And we probably said it. You just said it just now, Tony, but I'm not sure people heard it. And so those who were trying to discount what we were saying would say, well, you're just flip-flopping again. And again, I think that's a recognition of the fact that the general science literacy has not been particularly prominent in these conversations. Plus, there's been other agendas where people, frankly, were looking for something to criticize and pinning that on anything that sounded like it might get the attention of people who would listen to them.
I'm curious, have either one of you gotten any private communications from some of your public critics going, I know it seems, sort of trying to explain what's going on? Dr. Fauci, have you had anybody that has said, yeah, I'm beating you up on this hearing. I'm getting grief back home. I'm just curious if they've tried to soften it at all.
Absolutely not, Chuck. Not
No.
even the slightest hint of that.
None. Dr. Collins, none of that for you either?
Nope, sorry, none.
No, it's
No
very-
grace? And what you're telling me is there's no grace? I mean, I had somebody say this, that the biggest problem in this country right now is we have no grace for each other. Just a little bit of grace would go a long way.
Chuck, I have to mention something that you remind me of that is really, in some respects, charming, is when there were political disagreement without the animosity and the hatred of another person. I can remember in the 1980s, I was testifying before the Health Committee, and Ted Kennedy was there. It was the George H.W. Bush administration, and he wanted us to have more money for HIV. And I was sitting in the witness chair giving one of my many, many appearances in briefings and hearings. And he said, Dr. Fauci, what are you guys doing? You're not doing anything enough. You don't care. And he was banging me all over the place. And as soon as the hearing was over, he came down from the top, put his arm around me and said, Tony, I love you. I'm sorry I had to do that. We just had to make a point. There's nothing even remotely like that. It's all enmity, which is really unfortunate.
And that's what would you concur with that, Dr. Collins?
I'm afraid I would. And I didn't really imagine this happening in my own lifetime. And it's not just politics, of course. It's every issue. It's in neighborhoods as well.
All right, we're going to move. I got questions from the audience. And this is actually two of them were questions I was going to ask first anyway. But so I'll give the audience some credit here. So I'll start with a very basic one here, since we're dealing with it in my current residential state of Virginia. Many states are reducing mandates, requirements for mask wearing. What are your thoughts about these decisions and the potential impact on children? Dr. Fauci, I can't help but think, are we pulling a 4th of July again, or the vaccine, take your mask off, and we're going to look back and say, ooh, that was a month too soon. That was 2 months too soon.
Yeah, the CDC right now looks at the amount of viral activity throughout the country and has made the determination that given that there is so much transmission going on right now, it is really not prudent to pull masks off children. Now, we could get lucky because the trajectory right now is going way down. And it very well may be that if you take masks off the kids in the next week or so, it's going to keep going down. But you've really got to be careful. You don't want to say it's an absolutely wrong decision. It's understandable why people want to take masks off the kids. But right now, given the level of activity that we have, it is risky. And that's how I would have to describe it, Chuck. It's risky that you're going to start seeing infections in kids. The CDC came out today at 1 p.m. with an MMWR, which spoke about the large spike in hospitalizations in children who are 0 to 4 years old and even 5 to 11. Now, albeit it is true that the severity of disease in a young child on a case-by-case basis is not as great as an elderly person or an adult, but children are still vulnerable and they are still getting hospitalized. So we better be really careful if we pull back on one of the protective veils of children. You protect them by vaccinating them if they are eligible, by surrounding them with teachers and school personnel who are vaccinated and masked, and you try to keep the level of interaction in the classroom with good ventilation. That's how you protect them. If you pull back on one of those mitigations, you could create a risk that you would see an increase in infections.
All right, Dr. Collins, this next question, and I'm going to make you answer since you are not running NIH anymore. What advice do you offer future public administrators and how best to adjust public health policy based on the latest evidence while avoiding public confusion and exhaustion? And I'm going to add an addendum to this question. And it goes to, and I'll just say it here, I hate the boxes, the Jeff Zients of the boxes. Okay, I'll just be frank with you guys. It feels like it doesn't connect. And I don't know how you fix this. But what would be your advice for the next? I mean, I get, is it should the CDC be the face and spokesperson on a daily basis? I guess is where I'd go with this.
Well, first of all, I want to say it will continue to be a privilege and a remarkable opportunity to be in that role as a public health leader, bringing the best science to bear on these challenges for the world and putting it into practice, and knowing that when you wake up every morning, you are engaged in a noble enterprise. You don't have to think about whether you're wasting your time or not. It will also be the case, as we have seen now, that you can't just basically do great science and then go back in the lab and close the door. You are going to need to be a communicator. And I think we have things to learn about that. I said something earlier about maybe we should do more narratives and a little less statistics. But if we're going to do the statistics, let's do it really effectively so that it actually strikes people in a place where they can quickly absorb it. And let's not be afraid of saying all the time what we really don't know yet, because I think sometimes maybe we come across as having some sort of knowledge that we don't. We got to be as humble and in every way that we can about the limitations of what we have, and explain, as we talked about a little bit ago, that what we are telling you today is the best we've got based on the knowledge we have, and it's probably going to change, just like your stockbroker is going to give you a different recommendation a month from now than he did today. And that's not bad. That means he's a good stockbroker. You want a scientist who's going to do the same thing. But I do think it's a time to sort of step back and see, how has our communication strategy worked? I didn't know those boxes bothered you, Chuck.
Well, I say this, and I know it just feels less accessible, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to put it. And we have plenty of accessibility, but it feels like you're telling, I don't know how, and again, I don't know how else to put it, but it does feel like that's, who's the person that I'm gonna, connect with that gets me that information. Mm-hmm. And, you don't want it to look too government-like, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to put it. It is, look, we're all trying to figure out how to get, put more sugar on the medicine and whatever medicine we're delivering in the moment. Let me move to another question for you, Dr. Collins, and that is, what does the president see as the nation's most important science and technology challenges over the next few years? Obviously, COVID is one, but besides COVID, in your conversations with him, what was he thinking? What was he telling you?
Well, certainly not just this pandemic, but the risk of future ones. So pandemic preparedness, as Tony was talking about earlier, we are not seeing the last of these. We have ways we could prepare in the future. We have a pretty good idea of what kinds of viruses might be the next culprits. Why don't we start now? In fact, we are starting now to develop the next generation of vaccines and antivirals for those likely culprits and not wait to see which one turns out to emerge. That's going to cost some money and take some time. It's well worth it. It would buy us months if we encounter something in the future. So he's very concerned about that. He's, as you know, personally deeply concerned about other medical issues and especially cancer. And so this effort to try to come up with a way that we can end cancer as we know it, which is the phrase that he's been using, is one that I think we're going to see a lot of activity about. Not that we're saying in a naive way, okay, there will be no more cancer again. We know this is an incredibly difficult challenge, but we could reduce the number of cancer deaths substantially. We've already reduced them by 25%, and we could do more in the coming years. We could get better at early detection. We could get better at making immunotherapy work for solid tumors that currently don't respond very well. We could come up with ways to actually use immune system and chemotherapy together in ways that are more, and we could come up with better ways to deal with health inequities in that space. He cares a lot about that as well. And I think in general, he wants to see our medical research apparatus run even more efficiently and boldly than it does right now, which is the motivation for this ARPA-H, which is a big part of his criteria. And then I'll say climate change. The president recognizes that this is the greatest looming threat to our future. It's not like we don't have possible solutions, but they're going to take real significant science to develop other energy sources, and it's going to cost some money. It's going to require international collaboration. He's pretty good at those things.
You know, Dr. Fauci, I want to actually follow up on the on the vaccine technology, and just I don't think plenty of attention in the scientific community's been made on mRNA and this technology. Just how is this all vaccines going to go this way? Will we never have the old versions of vaccines?
No, not at all. I think this is an extraordinarily important breakthrough in vaccinology. Is very interesting that no mRNA vaccine had ever been done for any disease. And the first time up at bat, they hit it right out of the park over the center field fence, and that was it. So, but there are other platforms.
But you thought that going in, right? I mean, this was a technology you guys were big believers in, right?
Well, we were big believers, but there were a lot of naysayers, Chuck. I mean, Francis and I believed it, but there were a lot of people who actually criticized me of saying, why did you put all of your efforts, not all, but most of your efforts into this brand new technology? You're taking a big chance. So we had confidence. But there's a lot of other things, Chuck. There are different, what we call platforms. When you have a vaccine, you have what's called a platform. Is it an mRNA? Is it a vector? Is it a nanoparticle? Is it a viral-like particle? Then you got the immunogen design. The beauty of what happened with the mRNA is we had a brand new, really good platform, and we had the genius of people to get the right immunogen design to make this a very, very immunogenic vaccine. But this is not the end game, Chuck. We can do much better than this. And that's why we need to continue to make the investment in biomedical research, because I believe that as good as mRNA is, and our mRNA may also positively influence the field of HIV vaccines, of cancer vaccines, of vaccines against a number of other microbes, particularly malaria and tuberculosis. But we shouldn't say we've arrived at the end game. We can do better.
Is Dr. Collins, is the goal to have virus vaccine, like obviously not quite simultaneous, but how quickly do you think you can create this turnaround time if the funding comes through here?
Well, a lot of it depends on doing the early stages in advance of the outbreak. If you think that you could make a list right now of 7 to 10 of the viruses that are most likely to be the next culprit, why not go ahead? And presumably mRNA would be a very attractive strategy, and develop that first generation. You could bring that to the point of making a small batch of it, ask volunteers to get immunized and see if they raise antibodies against that. And then if that does turn out to be the next culprit, you have saved yourselves probably 3 months that otherwise would be lost while you're waiting to try to scale this up. That's entirely feasible, but that's a lot of work. It has to be scaled. You have to think about the manufacturing, all of those pieces. Same with antivirals. With COVID, The big challenge that was hardest to do quickly was to design a small molecule that was going to inhibit the replication of SARS-CoV-2. We tried a lot of compounds that we thought maybe could be repurposed, and we got a few hits like remdesivir, but we didn't get the real home runs that we're now starting to see some year and a half later, drugs like Paxlovid, which really do inhibit that viral replication because they go right to the heart of one of its critical steps. We ought to be developing those antivirals in advance as well, especially those that could actually work against a whole class of viruses, the way we're now trying to do in terms of antivirals for all coronaviruses. That's something we can do. That's not something that you just think about. You should be doing it.
By the way, Dr. Fauci, one lesson I've taken from this, in that I've gone over 2 years without a cold, without a flu, without a fever. I like my mask in the wintertime. I have a colleague of mine who was traveling with his girlfriend to Japan in December of 2019. And they were the only two people on the subway not wearing a mask. Obviously, 2 months later, yeah, and he goes, it was obvious who the Americans were. Hey, have we figured out how to mitigate the flu and we just don't do it?
The answer is very likely yes. There's an incredible experiment that was done inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
That if you look at the winter of the first winter we had through COVID-19, if you look at the CDC's flu view each year, they show you the peak. It goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down. That winter, it was like this, straight, no flu, because people were staying indoors. They were not interacting with people. We got the first hint of that when one of my colleagues from Australia, during their winter, which was our summer, called up and said, Tony, something strange is going on. We're not seeing any influenza this year. I said, what are you talking about? He says, no, we're having no influenza. And you're exactly correct. If we adapted the voluntary mask, because you don't want to get people to go off the wall about any mandates, but there were going to be some people who were going to say, during the respiratory transmission cycles of the winter, I prefer, if I go on a subway, I'm going to wear a mask. Or if I go someplace where there's a crowd, I want to wear a mask. I know that the respiratory illness incidence would decrease.
I just want this as part of my weather report now. Okay, high transmission. Bring an umbrella, bring a mask. Got it. Okay. Let's go from there. I'm going to ask a question just for my own here at the end to you, Dr. Collins, and the work you've done on the Human Genome Project. And that goes at the, I'm nervous about finding out too much about my genes. There's a part of me that says, do I want to know that I'm susceptible to X and live with that stress? And we're a family that's gone through that debate about getting tested for the BRCA gene, and a sibling got it, went ahead and got the test. So then we're like, all right, we got to know now, type of thing. Make me feel better about it.
Well, I think I can. There's a lot of research that's been done about this, Chuck, to try to figure out what really are the benefits and the risks of getting this information. And we are now in the circumstance of studying hundreds of thousands of people who've had their complete genomes looked at because they decided they wanted to know. And they've gotten the results back if they decided they wanted, but they could decide which parts to see and which not. There are 59 places in the genome right now where if you have a misspelling there, that is something you probably would want to know because it will help you reduce the likelihood of a bad outcome downstream.
Call it a misspelling. I don't mean to make you rewind there. You call it a misspelling. Why is that the terminology? I find that interesting. But
I think mutation sounds more scary and maybe even like you're blaming your DNA.
I mean, alien mutation. You're right. I'll have a misspelling in my DNA. Okay.
Yeah, it's a misspelling, and it maybe is something that in some other circumstance would have been advantageous, but in our environment, it's not good for you. So if you have one of those 59, generally people will be thanking you for saying, "Okay, I'm glad I have that because here's something I can do to reduce my likelihood of trouble." That Beyond that, though, to find out a lot of other things where they might increase your risk, but there's nothing you can do about it, most people are like, no, thank you. The famous one is ApoE, where if you have the E4 version, your risk of Alzheimer's goes up. Most people, when they're asked about that, I'm not really sure that's something they want to know, because right now we can't intervene and do anything useful. So, but it's an individual thing. So I hear your pain. Be reassured that there's a lot of work going on to try to figure out how to help you and not just hit you over the head with information you didn't want.
But I'm also a consumer of data, and I'm happy to contribute my data to make better data.
Okay, join all of us then, because that's a great program where you can find all of this out.
I will tell you, you guys, you may be concerned about what people have taken away over the last 2 years. I could tell you my now high school senior, her favorite class was biology the last 2 years. She's has no interest in going into the world that I habitate, but all the interest and wants to be in the sciences, and specifically the marine sciences, because she'd like to, as she says, help solve climate change. I do think there, and the amount of young people that are moving towards STEM all of a sudden, the science, I mean, it is, you guys are inspiring a whole new generation. And yes, the pandemic may have been an instigator to this, but I do think we're in good hands. We just have to skip over a generation or two.
Do you know about the Fauci effect?
What's
there
that?
are more applications to medical schools in the last 2 years than there have been for a long time, and the admissions committees are referring to that as the Fauci effect.
Well, I hear every science department is oversubscribed. What a great problem to have. This was a pleasure. Terry, I really appreciate everybody asking me to do this. Like I said, these are two people who have had on my show that I actually admire. Not to say I don't admire others that are on my show, but I really admire these two. Thank you.
We admire you, Chuck.
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck.
Thanks, guys.
Chuck, thank you so much for moderating the discussion, and thank you all for your thoughtful and engaging conversation. We really appreciate your insight and your candor and your time. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, I'd like to extend one more round of congratulations. I only wish we were in person so you could hear the applause, but to thank each of you for your extraordinary impact through public service in the fine tradition established by Elliot Richardson. And I also want to welcome you to the National Academy of Public Administration as honorary fellows. We're happy to be a new community for you. For all of you, this concludes our program. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.